Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you know when live we go. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. In this session, we are going to discuss today's newspaper, The Hindu, dated 6th of September 2020. In the next 40 minutes, we are going to run through the newspaper, picking up important articles and discussing them from civil service examination perspective. The news that we are going to take up for discussion has been tabulated on your screen and timestamping for the same has been given in the description section. Today we'll have a slight change in the DNS format. I'm giving the question to you right in the beginning. Next on your screen will appear answer to these questions. You take the quiz, evaluate, get your marks, and then you take the DNS, and then you take the quiz again and see if you will be able to answer all the questions after taking the DNS. This was suggested by one of you. I liked the suggestion and I accepted it. This will help you know what you don't know. This will increase your thirst for knowledge, your concentration level, and you can draw greater benefit from the DNS session. You can give your feedback if it is working out for you. There is an article on page number 12, the 13th Amendment. This amendment is the constitutional amendment of Sri Lanka. It was done in 1987. It was done in the backdrop of India-Sri Lanka peace accord that was pushed by Rajiv Gandhi government in 1987. And that accord cost the Prime Minister his life. Let me quickly give you the background in which this article has been written. Recently, Mahendra Rajapaksa has returned to power in Sri Lanka as the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. His brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, has been elected as President of Sri Lanka. So now the Prime Minister and President are from the same party. Last year in April, the unfortunate Easter bombing happened in Sri Lanka, and that incident gave rise to nationalistic feeling. And riding high on the nationalistic feeling, these two leaders came to power. The problem is that the Tamil-speaking population of Sri Lanka are not comfortable with the present leadership. And there is a long history for that. Mahendra Rajapaksa was the chief architect of dismantling of LTTE in 2009. And at that point of time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the present president and brother of Mahendra Rajapaksa, was looking after the Home Department. Also recently, Mahendra Rajapaksa has said in the parliament that majority sentiment has to be respected in Sri Lanka. Representation has not been given to minorities in Mahendra Rajapaksa cabinet. They also are rolling back some of the reconciliation effort that was made by the previous dispensation. For example, singing of their national anthem in Tamil language as well on the National Day ceremony. Most importantly, some of the ministers in the present cabinet have been publicly asking to abolish the 13th Amendment. Look, 13th Amendment is an internal issue of Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka is very important in the geopolitical strategy of India. A, because it is immediate neighbor of India. B, it has large Tamil-speaking population and sidelining them in Sri Lanka have ramification back at home. C, there is a factor of China. Mahendra Rajapaksa and his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa is openly known to be pro-China. They have given the Colombo port to China on lease for 99 years. They have given around 15,000 acres of land to China on lease. It becomes a geopolitical challenge for India how to engage with Sri Lanka in presence of a stiff competition by China and at the same time not dropping the issue of human rights for Tamil-speaking population of Sri Lanka. We are going to discuss this in greater detail than what has been provided in the article to have a satisfying understanding of the issue. Initially, we'll understand the history of Tamil Sinhalese conflict, which is continuing even today. Then we will see the demand of separate Tamil state in Sri Lanka that emerged because of discrimination against Tamil-speaking population. Then we'll see the intervention on peace process in Sri Lanka, resulting in India-Sri Lanka peace accord and 13th constitutional amendment in Sri Lanka's constitution. We will understand why this 13th constitutional amendment has not been implemented yet, and the root cause of that is the present semi-presidential form of governance in Sri Lanka. Finally, we'll see what ramification this is going to have on India-Sri Lanka relation and India's geopolitical strategy in the neighborhood. I'll quickly give you a brief history as to from where this Tamil Sinhalese hostility began. Sri Lanka was colony of Britain. Britain came in 1815 and went back in 1948. Back then, Sri Lanka was called as Ceylon. When Britishers came in 1815, Sri Lanka predominantly had Buddhist Sinhalese population, which numbered around 3 million, and the Tamils numbered around 3 lakh. So 90% of the population was Buddhist Sinhalese, 10% was Tamils. But there was no hostility, because in that proportion of population, there cannot be hostility to the extent of ethnic strife, civil war, bloodbath. That happens when there are two dominant ethnic groups. So there was no question of that before the Britishers came. The ancestors of the present Sinhalese population most likely came from the southern India back in 500 BC. And there is documentation of the contact between the Sinhalese population of Sri Lanka with the Tamil speakers from South India from 2nd century BC. When Britishers came, they started cash crop plantation on the island. First they started with coffee, then they went on with plantation of rubber and tea. And for the purpose of plantation, they brought around 1 million Tamil speakers from India. This was a general practice of Britishers. They have done it in their other colonies as well. For example, in Malaysia, they brought the Chinese, they brought the Indians, and there was Malay population from the beginning. But there is no ethnic strife in Malaysia presently. In Sri Lanka, the Britishers designed to develop ethnic strife. They deliberately segregated the Tamil-speaking population in the northern region of the country, and most importantly, they preferentially appointed Tamils to bureaucratic positions and sidelining the Sinhalese majority. This was the classic divide and rule tactics that the European powers have deployed in all their colonies. And because of this divide and rule strategy of Britishers, we see ethnic strife not only in Sri Lanka, but to worst extent presently in Rwanda and Sudan. It all has been sown by the Britishers. So obviously, if you will sideline the majority of the nation from bureaucracy, from government position, then there will be discontentment among them. But then there is a question of leadership also. When the South Africans got independence, they had a similar problem. The whites were subjugating the blacks for long, and now the blacks were in power. But under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, the blacks didn't start to subjugate the whites once they were in power. And today South Africa is the only nation in Africa which is flourishing. South Africa is the only nation where there is no problem of racism. But when they got independence in 1948, instead of taking the minority together, the Sinhalese leadership started to discriminate upon Tamils. They passed the Ceylon Citizenship Act 1948 that made very difficult for Tamils to get the citizenship of the nation. Around 7 lakh Tamil-speaking people were rendered stateless, 3 lakh migrated to India. They also made Sinhalese as the official language of Sri Lanka, sidelining Tamil and Tamil-speaking people. They forced the Tamil-speaking officials who were not well versed in Sinhalese to resign from bureaucracy. And only after the bloodbath that started in 1980s, in 2003, all the Tamils of Indian origin were granted citizenship, but by this time, only 5% of Tamils were left on the island. Because of the discrimination faced by Tamil-speaking population of Sri Lanka, they started the planning and contemplation of separate Tamil state, terming it as Tamil Eelam. Eelam was the name in the Tamil language for Sri Lanka. This demand and this sort of movement of Tamil Eelam was supported by one of the employees of British High Commission in Colombo, and he became the chief theoretician for LTTE, Liberation Tigers for Tamil Eelam. And finally in 1976, LTTE was founded by Velupillai Prabhakaran. LTTE in early 1980s launched a full-scale nationalistic insurgency in northern and eastern part of the country, because in northern and eastern part, the Tamil-speaking population were dominant, and still today the majority of Tamil population is in the northern and eastern portion of Sri Lanka. There is a long history of ethnic strife, the bloodbath, conflict, killing, butchering of people, everyone fighting everyone. Tamils killing Sinhalese, Sinhalese killing Tamils, Tamils killing Muslims, Muslim killing Tamils. There has been incident when military has gone to schools and killed all the students. Many mass grave has been found in the country. The history of civil war is depressing, it is devastating. We will not get into it primarily because that is not part of our syllabus. But what we are interested right now is the 13th Constitutional Amendment of Sri Lanka. So we'll come to 1987 when the first Eelam War ended. LTTE declared the first Eelam War in 1983 then there was second Elam war and third Elam war, and then there was retraction and re-emergence of insurgency, then there was bloodbath, then there was more bloodbath, and finally LTTE was washed out in 2009. But we will look at the incidents in which India had stake. And the most important of that is Indo-Lanka Accord of July 1987. Look, India was getting wary of this civil war going on in Sri Lanka because it was happening in neighborhood. And because of the civil war, there was a threat of influx of huge refugees into our nation. Additionally, there was the issue of Tamil-speaking population that had roots in India. So there was risk of insurgency in India as well. Also, being a responsible power hailing human rights, we had to do something about violation of human rights happening in our neighborhood. So Rajiv Gandhi government decided for a direct intervention by sending military to Sri Lanka. And because of the pressure from India, Sri Lanka got into this Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. And the most important outcome of Indo-Sri Lanka Accord was 13th Constitutional Amendment. This amendment mandated a measure of power devolution to the provincial councils which were established to govern the island's 9 provinces. See, Sri Lanka has unitary form of government, where the center is very powerful and overrides all the provincial government. In unitary form of government, there is no devolution of power. With this amendment, the ray of hope was that the unitary nature will change to a federal nature or a quasi-federal nature at least. The provincial councils that were formed were assured of power devolution to self-govern. Subjects like education, health, agriculture, housing, land and police were devolved to provincial administration. But because of the history of semi-presidential form of government, this was not an easy task. There were restrictions on the financial power of the province, and President had overriding powers by constitutional amendment of Sri Lanka. So any decision of the province can be overturned by the President. So far, no province have been devolved with the power of police and land. Apart from creation of provincial councils and the promise to devolve power to them, the 13th Constitutional Amendment also recognized Tamil as second official language of Sri Lanka. But there was a problem. It was opposed by both the Sinhalese nationalist parties and LTTE. The Sinhalese nationalist party thought too much of power is being shared by provinces and in turn with the Tamils. The LTTE deemed it too little because they were fighting for a separate state. And now they'll have to settle with only provincial power, and that too in a limited manner because President has an overriding power over the provinces. There was a third problem. It was widely perceived as an imposition by India, symbolizing the hegemonic influence of India, the dominance of India over Sri Lanka. Many political analysts say that had it not come under Indo-Lanka Accord, had it come from within the Sri Lankan government, then the picture might have been different today. But the ground reality is that the 13th Constitutional Amendment of Sri Lanka represents the only hope for the settlement of long-pending Tamil question in Sri Lanka. Even recently, during the bilateral talk with the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Mahendra Rajapaksa, Prime Minister Modi has raised this issue of implementation of 13th Constitutional Amendment. The issue of 13th Constitutional Amendment has come to the fore again because there has been demand from the cabinet ministers of the Mahendra Rajapaksa government to abolish the provincial councils that were formed by the 13th Constitutional Amendment. The argument is that they are white elephants, meaning too expensive and useless. They argue that in a small country, the provinces could be effectively controlled by the center and there is no need of different layers in the governance structure. The counter argument could be that devolution of power is not only for administrative purpose, but it can also become a tool for representation of various ethnicity in the governance and social harmony. That was the purpose with which 13th Constitutional Amendment came. So many political analysts are pointing it out that it is not the question of governance structure in Sri Lanka. It is the question of sharing any political power with the Tamil minority. Because in the 53-member strong cabinet of Mahendra Rajapaksa, there are only 2 Tamilians. And to understand it a little more as to why the present leadership is nervous about sharing power with the Tamilians, we'll have to go back again in the timeline of 1987. From 1987, things started to become worse in Sri Lanka. Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi decided to intervene directly in the Sri Lankan civil war, and he sent a peacekeeping force with around 1 lakh troops to Sri Lanka. But things did not quite work out well for India. LTTE started fighting Indian troops. India was forced to pull back, and 12,000 Indian soldiers died in battling the insurgents in Sri Lanka. In 1991, one of the LTTE suicide bombers killed Rajiv Gandhi, and later the President Ranasinghe Premdasa, who signed the Indo-Lanka Accord, was also killed in 1993. In 2002-2003, some kind of understanding developed between the Sri Lankan government and LTTE, and various ceasefires were negotiated. This was mediated by Norway. At this point, LTTE agreed for a federal solution rather than a separate Tamil state. And the government also ceded to give up the unitary form of governance in Sri Lanka and come to a federal structure. But this peace did not last long. Later in 2003 itself, LTTE declared themselves in full control of the north and east region of the country, and this prompted retaliation from the government. Then came tsunami of 2004, and after tsunami, there was brutal clash between government and LTTE over the question of distributing aid in the LTTE controlled areas. Then Mahendra Rajapaksa government in 2009 decided to go all out after LTTE, and there was brutal counter-insurgency measure taken up by the Mahendra Rajapaksa government. It is estimated by UNHRC that around 40,000 civilians died in the counter-insurgency measure. Anyhow, in 2009, LTTE was brought down and the remaining leaders and the fighters surrendered. The point I'm trying to make here is Mahendra Rajapaksa is the leader who is seen as the man who brought down LTTE. Thousands and thousands civilians died in the process. That caused collateral damage. Somebody's uncle, somebody's son, somebody's brother has died in the process. The wound is still fresh. And Mahendra Rajapaksa has come back to power after 2015 on a national sentiment. And there is no effort on the part of present Sri Lankan leadership for any rapprochement with Tamilians. Rather, they are pulling back on the rapprochement measures that was taken by the previous dispensation. For example, singing of the national anthem in the Tamil language for their National Day celebration. There is one more thing that I will discuss in this regard. As we have mentioned before, that 13th constitutional amendment of Sri Lanka is seen as the only hope to solve the question of Tamil problem in Sri Lanka. The reason is it has the provision of devolution of power to the provinces. See, the Tamil population presently is around 11% in Sri Lanka. So there is no way a government can be formed representing the aspiration of Tamilians. But however, in the northern and eastern provinces where they are dominant, there they can gain substantial power. So devolution of power is one way of bridging the gap and also empowering Tamil people. But that is not an easy task as long as Sri Lanka has unitary nature in its form of governance. So let me very quickly tell you about the present governance structure of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has semi-presidential form of government. In any semi-presidential form of government like the one that exists in France and Russia too, there is a president and there is a prime minister. The president is the real executive authority. Unlike the parliamentary form of government like in India, president is a nominal executive authority. But the role of head of government may also be exercised by the prime minister, unlike the presidential form of government. Let me very quickly give you a brief understanding of the three common forms of governance: presidential, semi-presidential and parliamentary form of government. In presidential form of government, we have only president as the head of the state and the head of the government. In parliamentary form of government, we have both a president and the prime minister. President is the head of the state and the prime minister is the real executive authority, the head of the government. In semi-presidential government, there exists both a president and a prime minister, and government is led by both the president and the prime minister. In parliamentary form of government, head of the state, the president, is not popularly elected. In India, he is indirectly elected. In parliamentary democracy like Britain, the head of the state is a monarch. It is hereditary. In presidential form of government, head of the state is elected, which is president. In semi-presidential form of government, the head of the state is popularly elected, just like presidential form of government. And then the president chooses for himself the prime minister from the majority party in the parliament. One of the chief distinction between presidential form of government and parliamentary form of government is the legislative responsibility. The head of the government and the cabinet is responsible to the legislature. Legislative responsibility means legislature can vote the government out. In presidential form of government, there is no legislative responsibility. Legislature cannot remove the president who has a fixed term unless there is a gross misbehavior, and in that case the president can be impeached. But otherwise the president cannot be removed. In semi-presidential form of government, however, there is legislative responsibility. The president who is leading the government, he is head of the government, is responsible to the legislature. And there is a process of impeachment of the president just like we have. Although in case of Sri Lanka, there is a role of Supreme Court as well. The impeachment process in Sri Lanka has to be accepted to the Supreme Court, which is not the case in India. This legislative responsibility comes from the fact that government depends on legislative majority. If there is no majority in the parliament, then the government will fall. And similar structure exists in semi-presidential government as well, because the prime minister comes from the parliament. The president chooses his prime minister from the party which has majority in the parliament. So if there is no legislative majority, then the government will fall. But in presidential form of government, there is no such dependence on legislative majority. There is absolute separation of legislature, executive and judiciary. In parliamentary form of government, executive is part of legislature. The prime minister, all the ministers, they are part of Lok Sabha or Raj Sabha. In semi-presidential form of government, president is not part of legislature, but his prime minister is part of legislature. So the government is partly part of legislature. Semi-presidential form of government is basically to bring stability in governance. Where there is coalition government and government is too often falling, there presidential form of government is brought about. For example, in France. France had the problem of coalition government and government was voted out too early. So to bring stability, they had semi-presidential government where prime minister will go, the government will go, but the president won't go. The president will have a fixed term. So that will provide a kind of continuity in the governance, and still there will be legislative responsibility. So Sri Lanka has semi-presidential form of government, but after 1978, the constitutional amendment gave president too vast power. The president can now summon, suspend or end a legislative session or even dissolve the parliament at any time after the parliament has served a term of 1 year. The president will choose his prime minister from the party having majority in the parliament, but this is a general feature of semi-presidential form of governance which is prevailing in other countries like Russia and France as well. President has the power to remove the prime minister or even the ministers, and it is very difficult to remove the president. Because all the provisions that you know about removal of president in India, everything is there, but additionally it has to be acceptable to the Supreme Court as well. And because of excessive power in the hands of the president, in reality, although despite 13th constitutional amendment, the form of governance in Sri Lanka is unitary. The previous dispensation, which was a unity government, they tried to change this and they have brought 19th constitutional amendment to curb the powers of the executive president. And they have tried to strengthen the power of parliament and independent commissions and courts and etc. But not much has been done regarding 13th constitutional amendment. And this is one primary reason, apart from the human right violation that often goes on, that the Economic Intelligence Unit in its democracy index has rated Sri Lanka as a flawed democracy in 2019. Now let's come to the challenge that the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka throws to India in its geopolitical strategy. Because of the stiff competition that India faces with Sri Lanka in terms of trade, in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of strategic advantage, India have to walk a very tightrope. You may also remember that in 2014, India abstained from voting against Sri Lanka in UNHRC resolution in Geneva. The resolution was calling for a probe into alleged war crimes by Sri Lanka, but India abstained from voting. This was done not to sway Sri Lanka away from India towards China. Also, the Rajapakshas, both the Prime Minister and the President, are known to be pro-China. It was Mahendra Rajapaksa's government that opened Sri Lanka to massive Chinese investment. They gave Hambantota port to Sri Lanka on lease for 99 years. Apart from that, they also have given 15,000 acres of land to Sri Lanka on lease. Hambantota port is a deep sea port and it can be used for strategic and military purpose. This deal was put on hold by the previous dispensation led by the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, but the present leadership wants it to be restored. We have done all we could to keep Sri Lanka a good neighbor and a good friend. Recently, India has announced 50 million line of credit for security and counter-terrorism measures and another 400 million for infrastructure development in Sri Lanka. We are trying really hard to keep the Chinese hegemony away from the Indian Ocean. But the question is, how can we continue doing it? A, when the government in Sri Lanka presently is pro-China, and B, it has history of subjugating the rights of Tamil-speaking population in Sri Lanka. That is the diplomatic puzzle that we need to solve. There is a news article on page number 12. What is the GST compensation due to states? There is nothing in this article that we have not done already. We have done two articles in detail, one in the DNS dated 28th of August and the other in the DNS dated 1st of September. And both these articles together cover the entire GST compensation issue in totality. So through this mind map, I'm just going to do a revision for you of the entire issue. Constitutional 101st Amendment Act 2016 brought about the concept of GST into force. The benefit from the GST that was envisaged was frictionless commerce across the borders. It would make the tax more buoyant, meaning as the GDP grows, the tax collection will also grow. And there will be no cascading of tax on tax. GST is going to subsume many of the states and central taxes, and that is going to reduce the burden on customer as well. So apart from increasing the government's revenue, the burden on citizens will also reduce. So it was considered as historic and it was considered as a landmark in India's fiscal administration. But there were fear that the revenue collection of the states will go down because of implementation of GST. So to allay the fear of the states, GST compensation mechanism was made part of the constitution itself. GST compensation fund was established and compensation cess were levied on luxury and sin goods to bring money into the GST compensation fund. States were guaranteed compensation if the GST revenue growth for the states is less than 14% year on year for the first 5 years. This 14% growth was year on year, meaning suppose you start from 100 unit, in the first year it should be 114 unit. In the second year, it won't be 128 unit because 14% now will apply to 114. That is what is meant by 14% year-on-year growth. It will be compounded. In the first 2 years of the GST administration, everything went well, and in fact, the GST compensation fund had more money than what was to be given to the states by the center as GST compensation. But from last year, less money started to come to GST compensation fund, and more gaps started to develop between the actual GST collection and the guaranteed GST collection for the states. Now when the GDP growth numbers are out, we know that the economy started to slow down even before the outbreak of COVID-19. And the shortfall in GST compensation recently has gone to the whopping amount of 2.35 lakh crore. This number has been arrived by the Finance Ministry. Finance Ministry estimated that the GST revenue gap for the state for the year 2020-21 would be 3 lakh crore. But 65,000 crore will come in the GST compensation fund. So this money will go to the states. But still there would be left 2.35 lakh crore which the center will not be able to pay to the states. But the Finance Ministry has bifurcated this amount into two categories. The ministry has said that rupees 97,000 crore of the GST revenue gap would be on account of GST implementation. Meaning if COVID-19 would not have been there, then the gap would only have been 97,000 crore. And because of COVID-19, there is an additional revenue gap of 1.38 lakh crore. Although this was the constitutional obligation for the center to pay the revenue gap to the states, but in the extraordinary situation of COVID-19 pandemic, the finance minister has said this is the act of God and center is helpless in this regard. So the states have to seek their revenue gap on their own. And for this, center has given two options to the states. Either the states borrow rupees 97,000 crore from the RBI on the rates that will be linked to the government security bond, which will be lower than the market rate. And the rest can be borrowed from the market. Or you borrow the entire amount from the market, but you get the assistance of RBI in this regard. It was also hinted by the center that the states will be given this money back. It's not that the center is going back on the promise, but just that the money will not be given now. For now, the states have to manage their finances on their own, and the GST compensation fund, which was promised for 5 years up till 2022, that will be extended beyond 2022 and the money will be given to the states. But it has become clear in the last few days that the center will be paying only the principal amount. Center will not pay the interest that the states will be giving to the borrower. When the states borrow the amount, obviously they have to pay the interest. But the center will pay back only the principal to the states and the interest will not be given. If the money would have been given directly by the center to the states, then this interest payment would not have to be done by the states. So if you look at that way, states are at loss. Many states have demanded that the center should borrow the money from the market and give to the states. Some of the states also have suggested that the money should be taken out from the Consolidated Fund of India and be given to the states. Some of the states also have suggested that the cess like education cess, health cess, road and infrastructure cess, which center otherwise collect, money from these cess can be given to the states even though the money is not there in the GST compensation cess. But however, the Attorney General of India has opined against touching the Consolidated Fund of India, and the center is not in the mood to heed to the other options offered by the state because center is of the opinion that the macroeconomics of India will be hurt badly if the center's fiscal deficit will increase and the public debt will increase. But however, many arguments have again come from the state that the center must be borrowing and be giving money to the states because the states do not have multiple options of borrowing that the center has. For instance, the sovereign bond that the center can release both in rupee and dollar, or the loan that the center can raise against public sector unit shares. Additionally, the credit that the center will get from the market or from RBI or for otherwise, that will be at much lower interest rate because the credibility of the central government is higher. It also has been pointed out that the states borrowing are also counted in public debt. So the credit rating agencies, the international creditor like World Bank, they see the net public debt and not debt only of central government or the state government. There is also a constitutional argument that fighting recession is the prime responsibility of the center and center cannot pass on the buck to the states to fight the recession. That's really everything about the current issue of GST compensation. There is a news on page number 6. Andhra Pradesh tops the ease of doing business. See, yesterday, Government of India has announced the 4th edition of Business Reform Action Plan ranking of states. See, Government of India, for the purpose of healthy competition among the states, started Business Reform Action Plan in 2015. And based upon the performance of the states, ranking is given out by Department for Promotion of Industries and Internal Trade. You must be aware that India has seen tremendous increase in its ranking from 2014 to 2019. India stood at 63 last time World Bank came up with ease of doing business ranking in 2019. And this has not been achieved without effort. In fact, Government of India has set the target to break into top 50 of ease of doing business index. And for this purpose, government has taken many initiatives, which you must know for the exam. One of that is Business Reform Action Plan. This Business Reform Action Plan includes 150 reform points covering 12 business regulatory areas, including the 10 which is there in the Ease of Doing Business Index. For example, access to information, single window system, administration concerning labor, environment, and other parameters are there. The obvious purpose is to induce healthy competition among the states, and states are ranked depending upon the number of reforms that they have done. Andhra Pradesh has done 180 out of 180. So Andhra Pradesh has topped with this exemplary performance. Surprisingly, Uttar Pradesh is at rank 2 and Telangana at rank 3. Government of India has taken many other initiatives to improve ease of doing business in India. For instance, District Reform Action Plan, on the same line of Business Reform Action Plan for the states. Integrated Form SPICE, standing for Simplified Performa for Incorporating Company Electronically. This integrated form has been developed by merging 5 different applications. Similarly, a e-form Agile, standing for Application for Registration of Goods and Service Tax Identification Number. Similarly, a common online form for registration for EPFO and ESIC is provided on Shram Suvidha portal. Concerning construction permits, you must know that online single window system has been introduced in Delhi and in Mumbai. Why in Delhi and Mumbai? And you should also know a Unified Building Bylaws 2016 has been introduced in Delhi. Similarly, enforcing contract is another parameter in Ease of Doing Business Index. There are 10 of them. And India's performance considerably lagged in enforcing contracts. In this regard, some of the initiatives like National Judicial Data Grid, Commercial Courts Act 2015 can be noted. For resolving insolvency and bankruptcy code was landmark. And because of insolvency and bankruptcy code, India's rank considerably improved. Similarly, paying taxes is also one parameter in the Ease of Doing Business Index. In this regard, you can note that there has been reduction in the corporate tax rates, introduction of GST, electronic system for payment of social security contribution. A taxpayers charter has been developed, and recently Prime Minister has talked about faceless collection of income taxes. There is an article from the Science and Tech portion on page number 12. Is COVID-19 setting off a Bradykinin storm in the body? See, I'll explain you what this is. In our body, there are 2 enzymes called as ACE and ACE2. ACE stands for Angiotensin Converting Enzyme. ACE. Angiotensin is a protein. Angiotensin is a protein. What does this protein do? This protein helps in increasing the inflammation and blood pressure. Why? See, when a tissue is hurt, suppose this portion of the tissue has been hurt. So automatically, in that portion of the tissue, there will be some inflammation. The purpose of inflammation is to make the access to this region easy, so that WBC and other enzymes and proteins can reach to this area fast and easy. So whatever help is needed, that help can be provided to this portion of the cell which is hurt. And this trigger of inflammation is given by angiotensin. But if the excessive trigger is given, that will not be good, because immense amount of pressure will come on these tissues and cells, and cell can die. So to put a brake on the signaling of angiotensin, there is angiotensin converting enzyme. So ACE does the job of putting the brake on the signaling of angiotensin, so that inflammation does not go excessively high. ACE2 is a homologue of ACE, quite similar in function, but there is one difference. There are something called as ACE inhibitors, and ACE inhibitors does not work on ACE2. So the story so far is like this. Angiotensin gives the signaling for increasing the blood pressure. ACE gives the signaling for decreasing the blood pressure. An ACE inhibitor inhibits the signaling of ACE, meaning inhibits the signaling of decreasing the blood pressure. Now the crucial information in the article concerning recent research in this area is this. Suppose this is human lungs, and you know that coronavirus attack lungs. The recent theory is that coronavirus get into ACE2. So coronavirus is hiding inside ACE2 molecule. ACE2 molecule has free access into the cell of the lungs. So coronavirus also gets the free access. I have told you that ACE2 and ACE are homologues. They are similar in function. So if ACE2 increases inside the lung, then the concentration of ACE will decrease. Because both perform similar function, if ACE2 is larger in number, there is no reason for ACE to be present there. So gradually the number of ACE decreases and the number of ACE2 increases in the lungs. But I have also told you that ACE inhibitor does not work on ACE2. So what will happen is this. Although coronavirus enters into the lungs through ACE2 molecule, but some of the coronavirus may get out of it and some of them will be detected by the body cells. So there would be some inflammation in some part of the lungs. And then the angiotensin will give the signal of increasing inflammation and blood pressure because of this infected area of the lungs. After some time, the signaling from ACE2 must have come. to decrease the blood pressure. Once the blood pressure has normalized, then the signaling from ACE2 must also stop. Otherwise, it will decrease below normal. And that job is done by ACE inhibitor. But ACE inhibitor does not work on ACE2. If ACE would have been performing this function, then well and good. The problem is not only this. The problem is compounded by the presence of bradykinin. Bradykinin is a compound which is related to lowering of blood pressure in human body. It performs almost the same function as ACE2, but it signals the blood vessel to expand and make it more leaky. The problem further gets worse because of hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid can absorb more than 1,000 times of its own weight in water to form a hydrogel. And because of excessive ACE2, there is already a storm of bradykinin. Hyaluronic acid in presence of bradykinin storm induces leakage of fluid into the lungs. The rapid accumulation of fluid in the lungs make the patients breathless. And then the more intensive care, even the ventilators become futile. So the scientists have come up with explanation that bradykinin storm may be responsible for some patients' condition worsening very rapidly. Although the article gives a satisfactory explanation, but we have to wait for the scientific community to completely accept this theory. Now we will take question for the day. Yesterday's question was this: estimate committee consists of members of Lok Sabha only. It's a correct statement. It has 30 members and all from Lok Sabha. Second statement was public accounts committee consists of members from both houses of the parliament. It is again correct. It has 21 members, 15 from Lok Sabha, 7 from Rajya Sabha. The answer would be option C. Question for today is this: there is no legislative responsibility in presidential form of government. And statement 2 is Sri Lanka has a presidential form of government. 1 only, 2 only, both 1 and 2, none of the above. With this, we have come to the end of the session for today. Thank you very much for hearing me out, and I hope you made good of around 40 minutes of your life.